Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 3, Episode 4. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, in this episode, you and I are going to delve deeper into the future of stores and this hybrid retail reality that we now operate in. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think we're going to keep coming back to this. It's really this idea that physical retail isn't dead, but it's certainly becoming very different. And so trying to delve into what that really means from an overall business strategy standpoint, what that increasingly means in terms of what sort of stores are going to be needed, what they look like, where they're located, what technology and operations need to change. I think that's part of what we'll get into. You know, it's also interesting. I know we'll touch on this a little bit, but we keep getting a lot of news about store openings and store closings. And Coresight, our friends at Coresight reported that store closings were down for the first time year over year in I think it's 10 or 12 years. So that's kind of interesting. And then IHL has got a little bit different methodology. They're reporting that for every retailer that is closing stores, there are 4 retailers that are opening stores. So again, kind of playing with this retail apocalypse narrative. But again, I think probably the more interesting thing is, what do those stores look like? What's the role of stores and how is that evolving quickly?
Yeah, that's what I particularly enjoyed about our discussion, because it gets into that kind of long-term decisions and lasting implications. But, you know, back to, you better start thinking about it now, because there's some opportunity. And I think you're seeing that in the IHL numbers. There's a lot of stores have closed. People have just rationalized real estate. You know, Starbucks closed hundreds and hundreds of outlets, but not in a we're in trouble way, but let's rationalize, and things are changing. So now, before we go in and start talking about delving into this, let's what kind of things caught your eye in the media last couple of weeks? I saw, you rarely don't talk about Amazon in this, and yesterday was a bit of a milestone, right? So we had Amazon open up their $1.5 billion transportation hub in Kentucky. What are you thinking? What are you thinking about Amazon these days, and particularly pertaining to logistics?
Well, we continue to see these last mile delivery wars. Whether it's a race to the bottom or not, I guess we'll ultimately see. But there's no question that Amazon, Walmart, Target, and a bunch of these third-party delivery players are trying to get closer and closer to the customer, narrow that delivery window. And so Amazon's just put an amazing amount of money into infrastructure, not only the big facility they opened in Kentucky, but many other facilities, buying more aircraft. So the infrastructure piece of this for Amazon and for others is huge. The other thing I thought was interesting that Amazon appears to be testing in a few markets is changing their delivery fee structure. So as we've gotten into a bunch of times, consumers seem to really love this convenience war and getting things faster. But at the same time, the economics of it for retailers are often pretty terrible. So Amazon and others, I think, are going to keep playing around with, how do we cut the delivery times? How do we narrow those delivery windows? But how do we not take such a bath on providing that service?
Now, in your mind, is that kind of speed to the doorstep a sustainable competitive advantage for Amazon? They seem to be saying that's where we're going to plant our flag in terms of where we're going to win. What do you think?
Well, one of the quotations I often include in my keynote and I include in my book is Seth Godin's "The problem with the race to the bottom is you might win, or worse, finish second." I think probably what Amazon is counting on is that they're going to be able to build this fortress, this incredible cost structure and efficiency that everybody's going to have to chase. And maybe with the exception of Walmart, maybe Target, there aren't many retailers that are going to be able to match Amazon and not have terrible economics. So I think the train's left the station on this. I think Amazon believes they can win. And clearly the infrastructure investments are a big part of that. And it's really, really hard, again, maybe with the exception of someone like Walmart, to imagine anybody coming remotely close, because it's just the cost of establishing it and the volume you need to make it work are just 10x, 100x for most retailers.
Let's move on to talk about earnings. Another week of earnings. Canada Goose was in the news with their earnings. Wayfair, The Real. Any observations from the latest raft of earnings?
Well, I think a couple of things are interesting. Wayfair, which I will fully admit to having been wrong. If you had listened to me about the Wayfair stock a couple of years ago, you would have taken very bad advice, because the Wayfair stock has generally done really, really well. Some of that is all the capabilities they built. Some of that is being kind of the right place at the right time in terms of this big move to home furnishings and a big move to online, and the biggest player there. But their earnings, to me, were pretty interesting, because we've seen a big move back in terms of volume online, not terribly surprising. Some leverage for them on the expense side, but I think this is maybe pointing to some issues ahead. Another set of earnings I thought were interesting were Canada Goose's earnings, very different kind of business model. They had major increases, certainly year over year because of COVID, but way up compared to 2 years ago, and yet their stock got hammered. Seems to be that investors are worried about this shift to more of their own direct-to-consumer stores and e-commerce, and de-emphasizing their wholesale partners. What's fascinating to me is it seems like that's the strategy that is winning for players like Nike and a bunch of others, yet somehow for Canada Goose, that seemed to be a measure of concern. But I think it's a remarkable brand, great results, particularly in the face of not great situation for apparel more broadly. So I think that's one to watch.
Let's finish on Saks, Hudson's Bay. Lots of news. Hudson's Bay announced they're following in the footsteps of Saks. Of course, they own each other and splitting off the Hudson's Bay, or Canadians would know it as the Bay business. Ian Nairn, who was the president, is now become president of digital, and someone I know, Wayne Drummond. He was we were marketing folks together back in the day at HBC. I guess I should have stayed. It turned out really he's a talented guy. So what do you think? I mean, and you got this whole new Saks Works, which is kind of a WeWork meets Saks. I mean, there's lots of interesting stuff going on for sure.
To me, this is either going to be genius or the dumbest move on the planet. I don't think there's much middle ground. I don't understand as we've talked about previously, and just following social media, I think, the real estate people seem to like the move. Everybody else seems to hate it, because it's against this idea that brands are horizontal, that, as I always say, silos belong on farms, digital drives physical, blah, 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 right? And so they're going in the complete opposite direction of, I think, probably 99% of retailers have concluded is the right move. And I can't imagine customers are asking for this. So I think it's curious. I think it smacks of desperation. The Saks WeWork thing,
Saks Works. Saks Works.
On the one hand, certainly working at Neiman Marcus, I'm pretty familiar with this sort of real estate that a luxury department store has. And generally speaking, those stores are way overspaced, and there are very much dead areas in parts of the store. So thinking about what you should do in the face of some pretty negative trends, more product being sold online with that third floor space where it used to be the fur department or something, I get it, right? Fixed cost, you want to leverage it. The idea that what the Saks customer is dying to have is co-working space on the third floor of a mall, I don't get it. I get how they might have talked themselves into it being a match made in heaven, but I don't see this being material to either company's success going forward.
Well, one commentary I can make is the gentleman who's running it, Carey, is a skilled retail executive who I work with. Again, another executive I work with who's done quite well. So if anybody can make it work, he can. So, be interesting to watch. All right. Well, listen, before we get to our further discussion, and just want to remind everybody, we now have a YouTube channel. So if you're listening to this on your podcast or whatever podcast, please check us out on YouTube. This section is on YouTube, kind of an expanded version. And with that, let's throw to the rest of our discussion all about this next discussion around hybridization. All right, Steve. Well, that was a great review of recent news. Now let's get to the meat of the matter, the what we're here to talk about, and it's this next part of your thinking is as picking up from episode 2, we talked about hybridization of retail, and I wanted to start off in some ways where you and I began many years ago, talking about this retail apocalypse. And very quickly, I remember when the first time you and I met, we were in a restaurant in Toronto, and Carboutet was there, and some other folks, and right away we aligned on this is all just a media narrative; it's nonsense. Has your thinking evolved in any way because of COVID? Is it still fact or fiction? Retail apocalypse version 2.0. What do you think?
I still think it's mostly fiction. It's kind of this narrative that won't die. Maybe it's gotten tempered a little bit, but it's certainly the case, as it's been for years, that e-com is growing much faster than physical stores. But when you actually look at the data, at least in the US, growth or sales through physical stores have been up for 12 straight years. And the projections are that it will be up this year as well. So it's kind of hard to say that retail is going away. Physical retail is going away if it continues to grow. There are also, as we've touched on a bunch of times, thousands of stores that continue to be open, including some pretty mature brands like Target and Costco. And clearly we've seen a lot of the off-price value retail guys like TJ Maxx and Five Below, Dollar General. They're all opening, literally hundreds of stores. So, really tremendous growth, including some announcements of pretty aggressive store opening plans that came during the pandemic. I think we touched on this on another episode that Warby Parker announced more store openings, quite a while ago now, and they're doing an IPO to raise some money to do that. So when you just look at the facts, it's just really hard to say that physical retail is going away. The other thing, and I guess the reason why maybe it matters just in terms of what it means for strategy is I always felt, and you can tell me if you agree or not, that part of the assumption was that as e-commerce grows disproportionately and obviously spiked during the pandemic, it comes at the expense of physical stores. Why would you want to invest in physical stores if they're slowly going away? Some of that is clearly true, but it's also true that physical stores play a role in supporting e-commerce because of things like ship from store and curbside pickup. So I think there's just a kind of a misunderstanding that is fairly pervasive.
Well, pulling on a couple of threads, it does lead for some decision makers to think, well, then I shouldn't do much e-commerce because it's going to cannibalize the store, and why would I do that? We've often talked about the most economically efficient way to do retail is, have them come and do it themselves, them being the customers. So can you see reticence amongst clients and amongst retailers say, well, why would I make this worse? In other words, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Or do you take a more strategic angle and say, let's get ahead of it and let's make sure, back to our second episode, that this hybridization, that you're on the cusp of that rather than on the tail end and the receiving end of the brunt force of these changes?
I think the guiding principle should be this idea that we've talked about before, the customer is the channel. And so you've got to figure out the best combination of digital and physical. In some cases, digital is really good at certain things and not so good at other things. And physical stores are really good at things that e-commerce, at least at this point, through technology can't do. So I think it's a matter of really figuring out what you want to do as your store brand, your retail brand overall. Right. Clearly some things you can do around the edges in terms of encouraging customers to behave in certain ways. But I think, the customer is ultimately going to do what the customer wants to do, and you have to adapt to that reality. Is
there an intersection point where there's enough movement of goods into the online space, into e-commerce, that there does become a apocalypse-like closing? Now, we've seen that happen in the U.S., but that's mostly because of overbuilt. We see the characteristics of the retail stores that are opening up change. When we talk about dollar stores and Dollar General stores, that's a very specific format. that is thriving. I mean, you read and hear about this 50-50 thing that could happen someday in retail, where 50% of e-commerce as a number happens. Is that a tipping point? Like, is there some point that you say, okay, a lot of stores are going to close? Because you're not very optimistic about shopping malls. And is that the tipping point?
Well, I think that's a big contributor. So if you take kind of the 20-year view, number one, as you alluded to, particularly in the U.S., I think Canada's a little bit better, and some of the European markets are not as challenged. There was just so much building of retail space. A lot of it was regional malls. I think regional, I quote the number in my book. I should have that in front of me. But I think like the square footage in regional malls increased like 4 times over like a 20-year period, whereas the population only increased 1.4 times. So if you just look at regional mall square footage, it got vastly overbuilt. But you've also got obviously plenty of other kinds of stores that got opened. So there's been this general oversupply of retail space that's just continued to get worse. Then e-commerce comes along, and generally e-commerce does mean you need less square footage. It's not true in every format, but generally speaking, you can get by with less retail square footage at fewer stores if you've got a strong e-commerce presence. So I think we'll continue to see significant pruning of store counts, but I think it's really much more about what particular kinds of retail is disproportionately affected. And for sure, the traditional mall is where we'll continue to see, I think, a lot of consolidation. But to the point earlier, we're seeing a lot of investment in retail square footage among retailers that have a winning business formula, and for the most part, they're doing it in concert with e-commerce. So
I guess a more nuanced question is, when I think of macro forces, I think about the work from home movement, which inherently drives less demand for apparel, which is a big presence in shopping malls. And the COVID era notwithstanding, where we're just getting out and socializing less, that too will pass. If not this year, next year, hopefully. So that should resolve itself, so to speak, or it doesn't resolve itself, but vaccines have resolved it. But is there these confluence of things that really accelerate the demise of some formats, as you said, whether it's shopping mall or department stores or apparel retailers? Are you worried about that or thinking about that?
So I think one of the big forces is something we've seen for a while, which I often refer to as the collapse of the middle, or this bifurcation of retail. Now, some of the bifurcation of, where you see success at kind of either end of the spectrum, the value spectrum versus kind of the premium, more experiential spectrum. Some of that has been driven by just the weakness of these business models that are kind of neither fish nor fowl, that they're stuck in the middle without a clear positioning. But a lot of that has also been driven by what's going on from just kind of the underlying economics of households, which is the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And so, the rich have the money to spend, and so they're sort of trading up or just spending more money in those higher end categories. And then the people that are much more economically challenged have an affordability issue, and that's driving more demand for dollar stores and those kinds of things. So, at least in the States, there doesn't appear to be any reason to think that is going to fundamentally change anytime soon. So I think that will put even more pressure on middle of the road kind of retailers. But in terms of a tipping point, certainly some of the big retail centers that have been struggling for a while, as they continue to lose tenants, as they continue to lose maybe some of these apparel players, whether that's from work from home or just in general, some other trends, there's a point where the economics just don't work and that center doesn't work, and you could have kind of a domino effect. So the other thing I think, which is maybe not huge in the scheme of things, and I think we've touched on this before too, is that if work from home persists at a reasonably high level, then you've got people, and I'll overly simplify it, but people that are spending more time in the suburbs versus the traditional inner city core. And so if they're in the suburbs during the day, then that may be where they're going to go have lunch or where they're going to go run errands that they might have otherwise run during lunchtime or right after work or something in a different location. So I think you see some reallocation of real estate. I don't know if that will fundamentally affect store closings in aggregate very much.
Let's talk about this whole COVID thing. Has this made anything better or worse in terms of these trends? We see flagship stores opening up again in New York City. It's 18 months of change, and it could be 2 years of two, even longer from a supply chain perspective. Let me rephrase that. Has the COVID era, really just exposed the weakness and strengths in the industry?
I think that's largely true. I mean, certainly if you had a weak value proposition to begin with and you were struggling financially and you weren't an essential retailer, like things got pretty ugly pretty fast. And that just made, either forced you into bankruptcy or forced you to just take an axe to costs and stores and things like that. So I think generally speaking, the winners continue to be winners and the losers continue to be losers. You clearly had some very specific reallocation of spending, apparel and accessories. You got hit very hard and people were buying Pelotons and office furniture, things like that, which are not likely to be phenomenons that are going to be so distorted as we go forward. So some people sort of got lucky, I guess, so to speak, from aspects of that. I think you may recall there was this prediction that Coresight Research made that 25,000 stores were going to close during 2020. And several people were out there saying that, well, different estimates, but a significant number of malls were going to close in the next year to 18 months. And I think about 8,000 stores ended up closing in 2020. Store closings, at least according to Coresight's numbers, are down this year compared to last year.
You think that's you think it's a dead cat bounce, though? Like, there's a lot of government subsidies that flooded in, right?
I think the biggest thing is it's a combination. The biggest thing is that lots of consumers ended up with more money to spend than I think myself included would have thought. And some of that is absolutely the significant amount of government stimulus. Some of it is, I'm not going out to eat. I'm not going out to concerts. I'm not commuting. And so if you kept your job, you've got a lot more discretionary income. And now I think we are getting, this revenge spending, pent up demand sort of phenomenon. So I think that, that put more money into retail during 2020 than I think many of us would have expected. And now we're continuing to see the effects of some stimulus, but we're starting to see some of these areas bounce back. But I think it is more of a dead cat bounce for some players. And so once we get through this period where the stimulus isn't such a big deal and people go out and just get out there and replenish their wardrobes or just
there's a big stockpile of cash, right? I think in Canada, it's been estimated about $200 billion stockpile of cash, unspent money. Now, not all of that's going to find its way into retail by any means, but a lot of it will. Like there's a lot of dry powder, that would use another metaphor, that is out there that is ready. Now, it needs some exogenous igniters. Geez, look at me. I'm continuing on this metaphor. You need people to go back to their normal lives, to go to parties again, and to go back to some degree to perhaps go back to the office before apparel really gets going. Right? I mean, there needs to be. You need to prime that pump. Just the fact that stores are open doesn't mean you need more clothes. Right? You need purpose for that. Right?
Yeah, I think in apparel in particular, you have kind of the wardrobe replenishment part. Stuff wears out, or if it's kids, they grow out of it, or, you put on 15 pounds, or you got in shape or whatever. There's a bunch of reasons why people will probably spend more on apparel than, a lot more coming up than they did last year. But the big driver for many categories of apparel is work or events or, things where you got to dress up. That I think comes back significantly more slowly, though I did see a report that Nordstrom put out that searches for work apparel or something like that were up like 125% over last year. So there's some hope there.
You've said in the past, and it's one of my favorite quotes, retail isn't dead, but boring retail is. But is brick and mortar retail boring retail? And how do you make it different? What do you do and how does it evolve in your mind? I mean, this is beyond what we talked about in hybridization, but really encompasses it. What's the role of retail stores, and how should retailers be thinking about what they should do next with their stores?
Well, the high-level concept is really at the crux of remarkable retail, which is those retailers that have a compelling value proposition where stores are important to the overall brand experience continue to do well. And those retailers that don't have that relevance and aren't executing it well continue to lose share. So I do think fundamentally it is boring retail that is, or even less than remarkable retail that is dying. But clearly we're seeing an ongoing shift for the role of stores. As we touched on in the hybridization of retail episode, we've got this, the old world of shopping was pretty much 98% you go to a physical store, 2% you go to a mail order catalog. And that has been shifting very dramatically. So instead of thinking about stores as basically warehouses where consumers can go and get stuff, they're becoming more than that. So I think that's going to continue to cause retailers to think differently about their overall shopping experience, the interaction between digital and physical. It's going to cause them to look at how physical stores are laid out and operated and maybe located and the size of them, because we've got this change where there's just much more involvement from most retailers, not all, but much more of a role of stores in fulfillment of e-commerce orders, whether that's buy online, pick up at store, curbside, or ship from store. I think it's become more obvious, though this has been a trend for a while, that stores play a role in advertising the brand. In some cases, it's very much as we talked about with Drew Green in our last episode, it's very specifically as a showroom where the product is there to be displayed, perhaps tried on, fitted, but you're not walking out of the store with product typically. And then there's also this so-called halo effect, which people might be familiar with. The ICSC studied a couple of years ago and has updated it, and other retailers have talked about this, which is when an online brand, particularly if you think about the digitally native vertical brands, when they open a store, they see their online sales go up in that trade area. So clearly, the store plays a role in driving overall brand sales. And we've also heard people like Macy's talk about, well, when they close a store, they typically not only don't make up that volume online, but their online business gets worse. So I think over the last few years, there's been more appreciation that, the store is a place to sell things, but you can't just evaluate it on sales per square foot that are actually rung up in the store because of this media advertising effect.
Well, that gets to the tricky question of, all of that makes sense. I mean, whether you're Indochino or, as we discussed in the last episode, Disney, who has an opportunity to make, big experience stores. How do you measure this? Like, what's, there's a whole raft of sales per square foot, productivity measures with employees. When the store takes on such a complex set of roles, how and where do we start in terms of measurement?
Well, it gets certainly more complicated, and attribution is not always so easy. I would say at a high level, if you really believe, and I think the evidence is pretty strong that this is true, that digital drives physical and vice versa, then I think you should be looking at total brand sales in a trade area as a more important metric than just talking about e-commerce growth and comp store sales growth or sales productivity, because you really can't tie those things together. So I think that's one measure. I think the other measure is to get into more kind of customer segment or customer persona type measurements. Are we growing? Are we acquiring? Are we growing? Are we retaining the numbers we need in the different customer segments we're trying to serve? And, some of those customer segments might be more physical or digital dominant. So you can kind of peel the onion there to understand what the drivers are. But when you're doing things like, you almost have to think about the fulfillment cost, right? If I'm not ringing up, just think about the case where I buy online, but I pick up in store, most retailers, I believe, are booking that sale as an online order, but the store is carrying the inventory and the store employees are doing the work. So
it's a bit mixed, actually.
Warehousing function.
Yeah, warehousing and picking function, which may or may not be efficient. Now, the good news is volume solves the efficiency problem and they get better at it, but they don't suddenly have a big back room to do pick and pack and prep. That's becoming a challenge for sure.
Right, which is why I think the stores are going to, if we're going to continue, which I think there are lots of questions about, but if we're going to continue with some of these really high percentages of e-commerce orders being fulfilled from store, however that looks, that suggests not only potential reconfiguration of the store space to get that to work better, but might also suggest that you don't want the store there, or you want to take that out of the store and create a micro fulfillment center or a service center. So there's this hybrid deployment as well that can go on, but it does, you do have to think really differently about the economics of a store from the traditional way you thought about it, which is, I can look at it as four-wall profit model and really just assign all the sales there. You also have, I think there are different kinds of engagement metrics that can inform. So, if you're, as Dick's Sporting Goods has done, put a big climbing wall into a store and takes a big chunk of square footage, or you're doing yoga classes or things like that in a store, well, certainly you hope that maybe when they come to the store that they leave that day with a pair of shoes or some yoga pants or something like that. But you have to think also, though, you're building a connection to that brand and loyalty that will keep you coming back. So you somehow have to look at, am I creating deeper engagement with the customers I really care about, and over time see how their sales develop. But again, the sale might develop that I go do the yoga class, but then when I get home, I buy online, right? It's not always going to be the case that my traffic to the store resulted in a transaction in the store.
I mean, as I listen to this, I think back to my time as a retailer. Boy, it's complicated. Like it was, we thought it was hard back then, but it's actually simple in the context of, are you selling in your trade area, up, down, or sideways, weak, strong stores, closed some, maybe we're in the wrong place. Now it's so complicated and feels like it's going to get more complicated. Has COVID made this even more complicated, or is it just going to move the needle forward in terms of how retailers need to think about it? And are we seeing, do you imagine we would see major retailers, whether it's, Target and Nordstrom's, Macy's, Bloomies, this Bloomingdale Bloomies, lots of major renovation happening in the next couple of years?
I expect we'll see a lot of renovation to the existing store base. I also think we'll see quite a lot of relocation or reconfiguration going on. Now, that'll happen more slowly just because of the way leases work, right? I mean, it's
sure.
Another 10 years on a lease. It's a different thing than having a bunch of leases expiring in the next 6 months. So I think that will take longer to manifest. And I think retailers will have to think about, do I want to put a lot of money to renovate a store if I don't yet know what some of the long-lasting effects of COVID are going to be? So, with the merchandise mix and the store pickup and fulfillment. So I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching, so to speak, on the part of retailers as the dust settles a little bit as to how they want to invest their capital. But I think COVID has certainly shined a light on not only the acceleration of many, many trends, but particularly this interaction between stores and the digital world and the fulfillment piece alone. And then we've also got a lot more retailers that are opening stores that are fundamentally more advertising in nature. So that also causes a different set of attribution and economic questions.
Well, as I said, it's getting more complicated than less, but I think it's really providing us lots to talk about in this season 3, because I've talked to lots of retailers, I'm sure you have as well, that are trying to figure this out. What comes next? And the answers are not straightforward in some ways. In other ways, the answers are there. It's kind of like, the X-Files. The answer's there. You think about it. And what I've always enjoyed about our discussions is how you think at a very strategic level and really encourage everyone to get past that day-to-day sales per square foot as one example and think really deeply about the role of stores and really deeply about how you measure customer success, right? And where and when and how that happens.
Yeah, and it's a cliche to say that what gets measured gets done. But and I absolutely agree. It's gotten a lot more complicated, and there's still a lot of volatility here in terms of what the future is going to look like. So that just adds to the whole complications. Yeah. But I do say with a fair amount of confidence that if you are largely anchored on comp store sales and sales per square foot, and you are fundamentally thinking of the role of the store as just a place for customers to go and get stuff, then that's too limited a view. And
you're probably going to make the wrong decision.
Yeah,
you may
you're
be
going to make
making
the wrong
decisions. Yeah.
Right. You may be closing stores you don't need to close. You may be spending your marketing dollars wrong. You don't want to be fundamentally in competition between your channels. That's not in the best interest of customers. So there's a lot of things I think that are demonstrably poor things to do. Exactly where you need to move to is certainly up for discussion and continues to evolve.
And continues to evolve over the course of our episode, season 3. And a reminder to the listeners that after Labor Day in September, we go back to weekly. And we have lots of great, interesting guests and discussion coming up as we all work together to figure this thing out, this big thing called retail and what it looks like. It's very exciting days, and lots more on the horizon for this and our podcast and all that other great stuff. But for now, if you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast platforms, so you can catch up with all our great interviews. Subscribe so that just automatically shows up. Tell your friends, and also in new insights and new episodes will show up every week. So tell your friends because that will help us share the word, the good wisdom. Now be sure and check out us out on our new YouTube channel. Not so new anymore. We got a couple episodes up there, and just look for Remarkable Retail.
And I'm Steve Dennis. You can check out more of my work at my website, stephenpdennis.com, or on Forbes, or on Twitter. And please check out my second edition of my book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, available just about everywhere books are sold.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast and a bunch of other stuff. You can find me on LinkedIn, learn about me on meleblanc.co. All right, Steve, great episode. Look forward to chatting again next week. Be safe and have a great rest of your day.
Same to you.